additional time to respond to any member's question if the time has been
You
ended.
said you were going to give him that opportunity at the end.
I am giving him that opportunity.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond to?
Yes, you may.
Yes, you got it. Sir, I think it's important when you look at those texts that you understand the context in which they were made and the things that were going on across America. In terms of the text that we will stop it, you need to understand that that was written late at night, off the cuff, and it was in response to a series of events that included then candidate Trump insulting the immigrant family of a fallen war hero. And my presumption, based on that horrible, disgusting behavior, that the American population would not elect somebody demonstrating that behavior to be president of the United States. It was in no way, unequivocally, any suggestion that me, the FBI, would take any action whatsoever to improperly impact the electoral process for any candidate. So I take great offense and I take great disagreement to your assertion of what that was or wasn't. As to the 100 million to one, that was clearly a statement made in jest and using hyperbole. I of course recognize that millions of Americans were likely to vote for candidate Trump. I acknowledge that is absolutely their right. That is what makes our democracy such a vibrant process that it is. But to suggest somehow that we can parse down the words of shorthand textual conversations like there's some contract for a car is simply not consistent with my or most people's use of text messaging. I can assure you, Mr. Chairman, at no time in any of these texts did those personal beliefs ever enter into the realm of any action I took. Furthermore, this isn't just me sitting here telling you you don't have to take my word for it. At every step, at every investigative decision, there were multiple layers of people above me, the assistant director, executive assistant director, deputy director, and director of the FBI, and multiple layers of people below me, section chiefs, supervisors, unit chiefs, case agents, and analysts, all of whom were involved in all of these decisions. They would not tolerate any improper behavior in me any more than I would tolerate it in them. That is who we are as the FBI. And the suggestion that I, in some dark chamber somewhere in the FBI, would somehow cast aside all of these procedures, all of these safeguards, and somehow be able to do this is astounding to me. It simply couldn't happen. And the proposition that that is going on, that it might occur anywhere in the FBI, deeply corrodes what the FBI is in American society, the effectiveness of their mission, and it is deeply destructive.
Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. I have a Rule 11 motion, Mr. Chairman. Clause 2. I move to subpoena Steve Bannon. Mr. Bannon was a witness in the House Intelligence Committee investigation. He was under subpoena. He refused to answer questions by Mr. Gowdy.
Motion. The gentleman is not recognized. The chair recognizes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr.
Chairman.
Cummings,
A motion is always in order. A motion is always in order, Mr. Chairman. It's Rule 11, Clause 2.
I will yield to Mr. Swalwell for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I move to subpoena Steve Bannon. In our House Intelligence investigation, he was under subpoena. He refused a number of times to answer questions of Mr. Gowdy. Mr. Gowdy appears to have a sincere interest in getting to the bottom of what happened, and so I move under Rule 11 to bring Mr. Bannon to this committee. Also, Mr. Chairman is in receipt of Devin Nunes's letter to our committee recommending that the Judiciary Committee continue on the House Intelligence Committee's investigation into Russia and recommended witnesses. So I move now for consideration for Mr. Bannon to be subpoenaed. And if he refuses, for contempt proceedings to occur.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
Chair recognizes
I
the gentleman
object
from-
to consideration of the motion that is being made.
And I yield back to Mr. Cummings. But the motion has to be heard immediately, Mr. Chairman, under
Mr. Chairman,
Rule 11,
I
Clause 2.
object.
Gentleman suspended. Motion is not germane, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr.
I move to table the ruling of the chair. I move to overrule the ruling of the chair.
Mr. Chairman, I move to table the motion.
Motion been made to table the appeal of ruling of the chair. All those in favor of tabling the appeal, respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the chair, the ayes have
Mr.
it.
Chairman, I asked for a recorded vote. I asked for a recorded vote.
Mr. Chairman, point of parliamentary inquiry. Gentleman will state his point of parliamentary.
On the vote to table, or for that matter, on the vote to appeal the ruling chair, Do we take separate votes of the two committees, or one vote of everything?
My understanding was that both you and Mr. Cummings were satisfied with one roll call vote. But we'll go through each committee in order, and then we'll take the cumulative vote after the conclusion of both committees.
I just wanted to clarify that point.
Mr. Chairman, I had asked for a recorded vote.
The recorded vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll. The question is on the motion to table the appeal of the ruling of the chair. The clerk for the Judiciary Committee will commence.
Mr. Goodlatte?
Aye.
Mr. Goodlatte votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Isa? Mr. King?
Aye.
Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Poe? Mr. Poe votes yes. Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes yes. Mr. Gowdy?
Pass.
Mr. Labrador? Mr. Collins? Mr. Labrador votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes yes. Ms. Roby? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford votes aye. Ms. Handel? Ms. Handel votes yes. Mr. Rothfuss? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? No. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Mr. Gutierrez? Mr. Gutierrez votes no. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu?
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? No. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Schneider? No. Mr. Schneider votes no. Ms. Demings? No. Ms. Demings votes no.
The clerk of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee will call the roll.
Mr. Gowdy?
Pass.
Mr. Gowdy passes. Mr. Duncan?
Aye.
Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Isa?
I am aye for both committees.
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Sanford?
Aye.
Mr. Sanford votes aye. Mr. Amash? Mr. Gosar?
Aye.
Mr. Gosar votes aye. Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes aye. Ms. Fox? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Blum? Mr. Blum votes aye. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Hurd? Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Comer?
Yes.
Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Gianforte?
Yes.
Mr. Gianforte votes yes. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings?
No.
Mr. Cummings votes no. Ms. Maloney?
No.
Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton?
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Clay? Mr. Lynch?
No.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes nay. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes nay. Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Lawrence votes nay. Ms. Watson Coleman? Ms. Watson Coleman votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Cartwright?
No.
Mr. Cartwright votes no. Mr. Desaulniers? Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Ms. Plaskett? No. Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Chair, how is Mr. Gowdy recorded?
Mr. Gowdy
The clerk will call the
Ask
roll.
not a vote.
The clerk of the Judiciary Committee will call the roll of members who have not yet been reported.
Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes aye. Ms. Roby? Mr. Rothfuss? Mr. Rothfuss votes aye. Ms. Bass? Mr. Jeffries?
I've been asked by the minority and the majority council to advise members that their votes will only be counted once, that they're on both committees, and the clerk of the oversight committee.
Mr. Chairman, point of order. On what basis would that rule be, since each committee is voting separately on that?
Procedurally, we have agreed to one unified vote. The clerk of the Oversight and Reform Committee will call the roll of those members who have not voted.
Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Amash? Ms. Fox? Mr. Hurd? Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Clay? Mr. Gomez?
Yes, sir. You just responded to that.
The gentleman from Missouri. Gentleman from Missouri votes no.
Mr. Clay votes no.
The clerk will report. The clerk will suspend. The gentleman from Texas is recognized. Mr. Hurd of Texas votes aye.
Mr. Hurd votes aye.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Mrs. Fox votes yes.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 38 members voted aye, 31 members voted no.
And the motion to table the appeal of the ruling of the chair is upheld. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for his questions.
Strzok, first of all, let me say this, that the